Hello, and thank you very much for coming along. This evening, we're going to look at charts, books, maps, and prints, imagining and representing the other on a small planet. How should we read a book? What can it tell us, especially about the other? The other is either a person or a group or a whole nation that is on the other side of a boundary of some sort, perhaps an ocean, perhaps on land, but they're outside of our group. They're the other. How should we read a book that teaches us about the other, whether it knows it or not? It's teaching us through everything it has. It's printed text, its images, and its maps. What can the book tell us? Well, we'll have a look. The problem has its origins well before the printed book, actually, with the manuscript chart. A porcelain manuscript chart is not easy to read. You have to get used to the imagery or the iconography, and then it becomes pretty interesting very quickly, like this particular chart made in 1375, now known as the Catalan Atlas, and owned by the French. If you look at the different panels in detail, you can blow them up, not very successfully, actually. Photographically, you need some fine photography, not just the average snapshot, to look at these things. But if you look at them, you can see some amazing information. A lot of this has been reproduced most recently and can be found in places like Wikipedia, or Wikimedia, as it's called. This particular panel is of interest because it's become a fascinating representation of Africa in the Middle Ages. It's been borrowed by modern authors to put on the cover of their books. Howard French has published a book called Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. Well, that's a grand sweep. We're not going to cover that kind of territory, but we're going to look at how the images have been important ever since porcelain charts. It's crucial to remember that a chart is not a map. Charts were designed initially to be used by mariners as navigational aids for their seagoing voyages. The result is they were of interest to a lot of people, including the Medicis, very powerful banking and political family in Florence in the medieval and early modern Renaissance period. The charts predate other kinds of things that emerge. In particular, books are also based on manuscripts, but eventually, in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, Gutenberg introduces the printing press, and books are transformed extraordinarily within a very short period of time to something that is printed rather than reproduced by manuscript copying. The history of this is well told by Ross King in his book called The Bookseller of Florence, but it's well to look into it because it has to do with the question of what we can expect to learn from books, charts, maps, and prints that they contain. The mapping of power and the power of mapping in early Europe was very much on the minds of the Medici. They had, for example, in the Medici Palace, a map room with a globe at the center and a representation of maps all around it. They were very interested in maps of Africa and began to collect them. Let's have a closer look at this porcelain chart from 1492 with the curator of the Beinecke exhibit that features this particular porcelain chart.
This map is the oldest surviving and dated Portuguese portolan chart. And unlike the one you've seen before, it has an extensive use of color on the inland. Notice if you're actually traveling by sea, you don't really need the inland features shown. Those are for landlubbers like myself. And so one of the perceived uses of these maps is by business people who wanted to know where they were shipping their goods, what territories were under the control of what suzerains, because they needed to know what taxes they needed to pay and similar questions. The really interesting thing about these Portuguese charts is they show much more of the west coast of Africa than earlier charts had. And in fact, this chart goes so far down the coast of Africa that they needed to put an inset. So in the middle of Africa, they've continued the coastline. So that's what you see there. There isn't some weird little aberration, but that's the coastline of West Africa. And this map goes as far as Sierra Leone.
Well, this is the particularly important chart that begins it all, and it's because of its detail that it's so much of interest to scholars. You'll see right away that it has a lot of very interesting color. The Red Sea, for example, is represented as red over on what we call the right, that is to say, the east of Africa, the northeast of it, the African continent, and the various islands are detailed with different kinds of colors as well. These too are very interesting in terms of the Madeira Islands and the Cape Verde Islands off the west coast of Africa. It's important to recognize that the outlines here are not written as lines, but as, in fact, compilations of names. On porcelain charts, they're interested in ports, and ports, in effect, are recorded by their names. Very interesting, and especially around river systems where access to the interior and potential trading partners becomes a matter of interest. You can see here in the case of the Senegambia region, they're aware of the Gambia River as well as the Senegal River and have navigated, or at least recorded the reports of navigation up these rivers, whether that navigation was by Europeans or by local populations that were telling them about the interior. They're so interested in ports that when they run out of calf skin or kid skin, which is what these porcelains are written upon, they actually insert a whole segment of the coast as an insert. An interesting cartographic invention. You should know that this is where it's begun, in a sense. There are plenty of inserts in the printed maps later on, but here in the manuscript maps on calfskin, we get a very interesting representation of the continuation of the coast down through a region that became known as Sierra Leone and right to a castle known as Elmina, established by the Portuguese under the regime that they imposed locally to recruit labor to build a fort in the 1480s. It's quite an extraordinary diagram, listing, as you can see in this greater detail, port by port by port, stop by stop, some of them in red, some of them in black or blackened or darker text, something that needs to be studied in detail, and each of them accompanied by a flag. Very interesting notion of planting a flag on top of territory. Happens over here, on the coast, and then in the extension of the coast of Sierra Leone and Elmina down there. Now, this is the detail of the 1492 Portulan at Yale, but it's only part of what Alida Metcalf has started to talk about in a book called Mapping an Atlantic World, circa 1500. Now, Alida is very informed about these matters, one of the world's greatest experts, and she's one of the first to point out that maps are not charts and charts are not maps. But then the book editors probably said, well, you've got to use the word mapping because people don't know about charting. Mapping the world is a very interesting proposition because it starts to change the nature of our understanding. She reproduces her cover map from the 1502 Cantino Planisphere, which is a Portulan chart. She then goes on to give details about the chart, and especially those about Africa, where you can notice some very interesting things right away. Again, hyper detail about port of call after port of call after port of call. The names are given. Hard to read in some cases, but they're given in red and in black. Very interesting series of details. At the same time, in the interior, there's a totally fantastic representation of what's there or what's thought to be there. Sierra Leone, the mountains of the lion, are represented quite literally as a sketch of a lion, a mountain. And then towns are represented in these forms here, and castles are represented very much as if they're European artifacts with flags on the tops of their medieval structures. Local populations are represented without much clothing in front, almost dancing, in any case walking, and the parrots and the pigeons are abundant as well in these extraordinary documents. The combination of precision and fantasy is characteristic. We have to learn how to read the iconography of this fantastic representation. It can be done, and it is done with great emphasis upon maps that show power. When it comes to mapping land areas, as opposed to charting sea areas, the question of dominant control becomes crucial. And one of the key reasons why these maps take on these symbols of flags is that they're representing no longer something just used by the mariners to navigate from port to port, but they're being used as representations by either the Spanish or the Portuguese to take to the Pope to indicate who is in charge of what regions and what islands off of the regions in Africa. So they've shifted in their function from being a chart for mariners to a declaration of power to the Pope. This is all before the printed book. Some of these representations are really quite amazingly powerful in their imagery, and you should look at them in detail when you can get access to them. These are representations of European castles in Africa with the power representations and flags to go with it. Fascinating. But how do we get from the manuscript sea charts to printed maps? This is one of the Portuguese portulans in 1619, but a Dutch map is printed on paper, not a manuscript on kidskin or calfskin, but a map on paper only 16 years after the representation on the kidskin. Well, how does that happen? What new expertise is needed for printing? What old expertise is lost in moving from the portulon chart to the printed map? How do the images and the imagination change from the charts to the maps? Oh, one thing you can notice very quickly is that the flags disappear. Flags are all over the late portulon charts to indicate power. In this case, on this particular Portuguese portulon, there's an indication that the Dutch have taken over by 1619 this castle that was initially created by the Portuguese, and the Dutch have a toehold in the northern part of South America as well. You can see it from their flag. Neither of those flags are present on a printed map, which is very clearly trying to echo, in some respects, the Portuguese portulon. The flags are not there. Instead, what we get is a cartouche, which has information in it, but a different kind of information. And that's part of the shift in imagination and in representation. Now, the person who's looked into this most thoroughly and knows most about it is an expert at the Library of Congress, John Hessler. They refer to him here as the cartographic specialist. That's an understatement. He is perhaps the world's leading authority on maps of the New World. And he's been trying to sort out facts from fictions, looking at the mysteries of the Renaissance cartography. It's worth listening to how he puts the problem.
In fact, Dr. Hessler has posed a series of underlying questions about the cosmology and epistemology of map makers and the circuits of transmission they reveal as a crucial topic that deserves our extended research. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Historians of science generally divide unsolved problems into really two different camps. One, factual. Those are things like, is the JCB map printed before 1513? Do the 1507 globe gores come before the 1507 map? All of these sort of factual controversies that surround Waldseemüller scholarship. And the other part of it is historians of science tend to talk about conceptual issues. And those of you who know any of my work know that I'm really not so interested in the factual stuff. I'm much more interested in the conceptual grounding of the things. What I want to know is, how did Waldseemüller think? What was it like to be a humanist cartographer sitting in Saint-Dié trying to come to terms with all of this new information that was coming at them? Now, so I'm going to deal with just a few conceptual issues today. One, and from my perspective, the most important issue conceptually and historically in any scholarship on early maps is the problem of transmission. It's an issue that is rarely dealt with in scholarship in any detailed way. Most of the cartographic scholarship deals with what I will call coastline matching. This map must have come from this map, must have come from this map. Also a lot of linguistic work. And that's interesting, but it doesn't really give us any sense of the networks of transmission. How is this information flowing? What networks are being established that allow this information to flow?
He's underscored that all historical maps present complex questions that deserve both extended factual research and in-depth humanist scholarship in history, culture, and worldview of the map makers and publishers. With these valuable guidelines in mind, how might we most fruitfully undertake African historical cartography?
He refers to the comparative coastline efforts, but he's not really interested in that. Sure, you can take two different portulans and compare them name by name, place by place, up and down the coast. And it's a very skillful task to undertake. You need to know medieval Portuguese, you need to know local languages, you need to realize what's being represented by the iconography of green and red and the like. Very detailed work needs to be undertaken here by European, African, and international scholars. But what he points out is that he's really much more interested in the other question, which are conceptual questions, not just technical ones. What are the networks of transmission? How do we know, and how did they know, how to represent on paper what they knew from the charts? How did that information pass from the Portuguese and those who were presenting and creating the charts in manuscript form, whether it was in Portugal or in Mallorca or in Genoa, the different schools of chart manufacturing, you might call it? How did that information, what was the network of transmission of that information to the Dutch by 1635 in 16 years flat? Basically, a whole lot was going on that we don't know much about. Sure, the Medicis were interested in Africa, and the booksellers were interested in selling books and developing the new technology to do that. And as we've seen, the Europeans are interested in the mapping of power, and there's a good reason for that. They were engaged in various empires of the sea in the Mediterranean, and their technology had a lot to do with warfare on the sea, manned by either ships being rowed by teams, hundreds, thousands, when you look at them, thousands of slaves, or by the Spanish and the Portuguese galleons that were beginning to emerge in the Mediterranean. This was a period of extraordinary conflict. You can see from the maps at the time, Hungary and Transylvania as maps from the period showing the warfare, basically, and an area that became known as Esclavonie. Esclavonie was that area in southern Hungary. Here's Budapest, for example, Buda and Pest. Here's Lake Balaton. And right south of this region is an area that became known on the French maps, in any case, as Esclavonie. This became quite different from what was happening in Northern Europe. In Northern Europe, trade was being dominated by a new form of technology, new forms of ships that were being created to dominate the seas in a very different way. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company was founded. This turns out to be a very significant event, not only in European history, but in world history. And the reason is this: it's the first joint stock company in modern history. It's made up of a bunch of merchants who pool their capital in a stock exchange and use that capital to build ships and emerge as a dominant naval force just when the Mediterranean powers are consuming themselves in horrific battles for control between small galleons and slave-rowed ships. In Northern Europe, the effort is very different. From the Dutch East India Company, the attempt is to move not to control territory, but to control ports. enclaves, as they were known. And they do it through military technology devised for ships and applied from the 15th century onwards, and certainly during the 16th century, through a greater use of maps and the study of maps, so much so that the artists themselves become representatives of maps. And geography takes over in the imagination as the Dutch take over from the Portuguese and the Spanish. If you look at the size of their ships, you can understand why. This is a Dutch ship back here. Here's a Portuguese sized ship, which you can see is quite a bit smaller. And it's for this reason that the Portuguese are ultimately defeated by the Dutch. And the Dutch take over the large international trading routes. Now, this commerce and cartography on colonial frontiers is a matter of great interest to scholars from all over the world. In particular, those looking at the New World, as well as those looking at commerce in Africa and the Mediterranean. In the New World, the Dutch come to dominate. They settle New Amsterdam, which is also known on their early maps as New Yorka. And it's very clearly part of a new territory that they're taking into account as part of their enclave economies. There's a lot of loose talk these days about making America great, but many of those who engage in that talk don't have very much sense of what made it great in the first place. It's very clear from the iconography of these early maps that the labor force imported from Africa was crucial for the developing of the New World. Of course, this means that there was a complex interaction between the histories of Europe and Africa over time. And the history of mapping shows it. Basically, if you trace the history of any place in Africa, it's represented in European minds in different ways. Senegal is imaged very differently over the 500 years of contact that we have from the Portulan charts right through to the modern day. And on those maps, a very different kind of imagery starts to emerge over time about Guinea, about the inhabitants of Guinea or the Gold Coast. And on each different map, there is lots of information to the cartographic historian, which can now share them with each other through the digital technology that's been devised. This has led to a study of a new kind of approach to the slave trade, looking at stones and plants as well as maps, and underscoring the fact that empire itself has an ecology that needs to be examined. It's very different in part because of the way in which we look at structures like this very differently, depending upon who you are, where you are in this trade, and what was your position in reference to structures that are not casual. These are stone structures. Stones don't assemble themselves in these forms spontaneously. They're built. And workers read images like this in a very different way than those who are their masters. This is something brought to light by a very powerful poem in the modern era, entitled A Worker Reads History. It has a series of questions. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with the names of kings. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy bullocks of stone? And Babylon, so many times destroyed, who built the city up each time? In which of Lima's houses, that city glittering with gold, lived those who built it? In the evening, when the Chinese wall was finished, where did the masons go? Imperial Rome is full of arcs of triumphs. Who reared them up? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Byzantium lives in song. Were all her dwellings palaces? And even in Atlantis of legend, the night the seas rushed in, the drowning men still bellowed for their slaves. Young Alexander conquered India. He alone? Caesar beat the Gauls. Was there not even a cook in his army? Philip of Spain wept as his fleet was sunk and destroyed. Were there no other tears? Frederick the Great triumphed in the 7 Years' War. Who triumphed with him? Each page a victory. At whose expense the victory ball? Every 10 years, a great man. Who paid the piper? So many particulars, so many questions, so many questions. That's the way Bertolt Brecht put it in his poem, When a Worker Reads History. Think for a moment in the Atlantic trade. Millions of people were transported thousands of miles over hundreds of years. Was there not even a cook on board? What about the prior plantation and Africa's industrious revolution? There had to be an industrious revolution because a lot of work was involved. Without mechanization, based on plantation agriculture, developed on prior plantations in Africa, enabling the Industrial Revolution to emerge from the cash cropping of colonies in the Western world. Yet in Africa, there is a silent and eerie eloquence of stone structures that is a tribute and a testament to the Atlantic trade. It's written in stone and in books. The diagrams of these castles are available in the books. And in fact, so are the illustrations that indicate things were being grown under the control of particular European powers and placed on maps that are in Dutch or in French or in English and include diagrams of the floor plans of these castles, which you can look at in great detail, blow up or shrink down now, and look at in their larger context, a context provided in fold-out maps from these books. We can understand the relationship then between this kind of castle and this kind of garden, as it's called in the French jardin. We can map the bigger picture. We need to map the bigger picture. And we need bigger maps. We can look at the bigger maps in greater detail now that we can blow them up in digital form and examine this one, for example, the 1753, of this region of the Gold Coast and the Cape Coast Castle. It's called the Gold Coast in Ouida, this region of West Africa. And if you zoom in on it with these maps, you can realize that there's so much going on in this region that they actually use that porcelain technology that was developed of the insert and create a whole insert here within the map that details each one of these forts along the coast. So much is going on that any one castle can't quite contain it. So think of this for a moment. Was there not even a cook on board? What about the industrious revolution in Africa that made the industrial revolution in Europe possible? If you map the big picture, you can start to see what these different structures look like. Here's the floor plan we've just seen, and here's the garden, inserted into a diagram of the castle itself. Let's take a look.
And in this case, for example, we're looking at a slaving castle in West Africa. And the advantage of digitizing it, which Tom made clear to me with his gallery space, was if you digitize it at a fine enough resolution, like 600 dots per inch, you can start to look at things in detail. And I'll show you a bit of this just as an example. This is a slaving castle, which is under British control by 1753 in West Africa. In fact, it's based on a diagram that was made in 1727, so they were in control of it for quite a while. But you can look at the different compartments in the floor plan on one level. But far more interesting for the work that a lot of African historians are doing now is the insert in the upper right-hand corner, which is a map. And it shows you the location of the castle under the designation of A, the castle, in reference to Cape Coast Gardens. Now, when you think of it, this is something that is absolutely crucial to study, but nobody's done it. And you can figure out why they haven't done it fairly quickly as well. That is, it took a lot of food to feed millions of people traveling thousands of miles over hundreds of years. But nobody's asked the question, who provided the food? In other words, nobody's looked at the prior plantations that had to have existed in Africa in order to fuel and feed the transatlantic trade. Now, it's fairly clear why you wouldn't find that, because those engaged in the trade jealously guarded their food sources as a matter of trade secrets. They didn't go splashing this stuff around. They didn't want their competitors to know how they were doing it. And then those who were involved in the production in local villages had no particular interest, especially after the slave trade, in revealing what their role had been in the food supply for the slave trade itself. Now, it gets fairly interesting fairly fast when you begin to realize that these old diagrams are embedded within fort plans for the most part. And what we've started to do in a group called the Africa Map Circle is look systematically at some of these old diagrams. Let me show you what I mean by example. There is a group that is online that's called the Africa Map Circle. And anybody can log on to it. And we're in fact encouraging more and more American historians as well as African historians to get access to it. And we've made some resources available for them to explore. As I was mentioning earlier, once you give students the tools to explore something, you got to get out of the way, because they are so interested and so motivated to look at collections like the Library of Congress, map collections relating to Africa, those of the New York Public Library related to Africa, Those are the Stanford University libraries related to Africa. So all of these things are just portals into their collections. The maps of Africa from the Illinois Library, Northwestern University Library. These are the centers that have strong African studies programs. The Yale University Library, for example, has fantastic maps that we weren't able to share, didn't even know existed before we started teaching digitally. But in the COVID moment, we've come to teach digitally and learn how to teach digitally. And Tom Paris' papers examples here have given us an inspiration of how to proceed, because you can look at an atlas like this, which of course you'd never get access to as a normal researcher. In the 50 years I've been doing research on African history, I've never been given access to an atlas that is this rare and ensconced in so many layers of permission that you can't possibly hope to work with it in paper. Even if you got access to it, you couldn't lean over it and get up close enough to it to make it mean much. But if it's digitized at 600 dots per inch, you can see Africa from a whole new point of view, especially in this case, since they draw it upside down, which is the classic Eurocentric vision of Africa at the time. We're looking at it from across the Mediterranean, as it were. And just by way of illustrating to African historians and Africans how their own continent has been portrayed, it's fascinating subject matter, which we shared in a meeting last month with the University of Ghana. But this is only one of the collections, as I say, and perhaps the richest collection exists in Afroterra. I don't know if any of you know about Afroterra, but it's an extraordinary collection. And its first map that it shows you is this kind of thing. They give you the map details and the like, but they've organized themselves as the free, you can see up in the upper left-hand corner, it's the cartographic free library on Africa that can be used by anyone in the world. And the real extraordinary feature of this was put together by the owner of the collection. It's a private collection. A fellow named Gerald Rizzo. He's a doctor, but he's a kidney doctor in St. Petersburg, Florida. That is, I've only seen him 3 or 4 times, but we've corresponded voluminously because of the richness of his collection. One of which you can see very quickly here, he's invented and devised a system for scanning these maps. It's very, very interesting. And this is a map which you can see north is indicated to the left. Not a convention that we follow any longer, but the Dutch did at the time. And you can see very quickly and probably identify for your own purposes what the subject matter here is. This, in fact, is Robben Island in the center of a bay on a Dutch map, which is the Cape Town, South Africa Bay. Now, for those of us interested in the millions of people transported thousands of miles over hundreds of years, what was of equal interest to the prison system that was developed in the islands off the coast was, as we zoomed in on this, the gardens. The gardens, again, in relation to a fort. And the buildings represented in the pink, the gardens that are the government gardens, but then also the gardens off to the side in the southwest, or the lower left corner here, the private gardens. And of course, with the Dutch flag on it here. This is a Dutch company, and the British often referred to the South Africa as a cabbage patch on the way to India. Their particular interest in South Africa was not the territory itself, but the fact that it was a provisioning station on the way to their real empire, that is the Indian Empire.
Well, these are the kinds of things that show up in books that are now preserved in libraries and can be read in detail by current generations of historians, cartographers, and art historians who look at the representation of the other in these early printed texts. Very interesting representation, especially of men and women in various different roles, whether they're ambassadors, interpreters, court attendants, or royalty smoking clay pipes from the Dutch. You can see in detail the different forts and, in fact, see them in their context of the islands upon which they existed. And look at the imagery of the cartouche. Very interesting representation of women, for example, in the cartouche, becoming more and more fantastic as the different dukes, like the Duc d'Orléans, presented to the king various maps of West Africa. In fact, French cartography and African history is very important to examine in detail. A whole series of very famous cartographers are influential in imagining and then imaging Africa in the 18th century. By the late 18th century, this gets translated into geographies. You can actually see these things up close and examine, for example, something that was engraved for Middleton's complete system of geography. Well, these are the kinds of things that show up in books that are now preserved in libraries and can be read in detail by current generations of historians, cartographers, and art historians who look at the representation of the other in these early printed texts. Very interesting representation, especially of men and women in various different roles, whether they're ambassadors, interpreters, court attendants, or royalty smoking clay pipes from the Dutch. You can see in detail the different forts and, in fact, see them in their context of the islands upon which they existed. And look at the imagery of the cartouche. Very interesting representation of women, for example, in the cartouche, becoming more and more fantastic as the different dukes, like the Duc d'Orléans, presented to the king various maps of West Africa. In fact, French cartography and African history is very important to examine in detail. A whole series of very famous cartographers are influential in imagining and then imaging Africa in the 18th century. By the late 18th century, this gets translated into geographies. You can actually see these things up close and examine, for example, something that was engraved for Middleton's complete system of geography. And the European cartography of the age is dominated by the French during the 18th century. In the 19th century, it has a lot to do with representing idealized pictures of African life in things like Middleton's complete system of geography, where the dress of female inhabitants of Ouida on the Gold Coast is presented in detail. You can take a look at some of this and, in fact, zoom in on it a bit, where you get the representation of three different classes of women, numbered 1, 2, and 3, and the representation of what they're wearing. Men are also represented, but in more and more caricatured form as the slave trade goes on. Now, a lot of this was quite violent encounters on the open ocean, and some of that's captured in the pictures of the artists at the time. But the prints, in fact, represent a much more pacific image. Surely, mariners were in search of calm seas and accessible ports. And as you can see from this picture of the Cape Coast Castle on the west coast of Africa. Nothing could be more peaceful. Although the violence is somewhat present in the presence of this castle in the back, there's no real discussion of this as a component of the slave trade. It's so popular, though, that it's actually reproduced as a quote. You can see the image here. And then when the technology emerges to transfer images to flatware, to platters like this, they're transferred onto plates, and serving plates in particular, so that you can enjoy the image while you're having your meal. As it says, Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast of Africa. This one, too, is manufactured in the Americas in the 1830s. And you can see on it that it's of Christiansborg, the Danish settlement on the Gold Coast of Africa. You can see it's an American ship because it's flying the American flag here, probably as part of the effort to suppress the slave trade. Interesting idea that you put that on a plate in order to have a meal. In our day, ceramics have emerged once again as a way of recording important things. And the Yale exhibit has received the World Cup prize from a group of citizens. In our digital age, when QR codes can be printed on ceramics now, not just print transfers from early books, but how can we read charts, books, maps, and prints to discover our place in space, perhaps over a cup of coffee? It's interesting to see the progression of this because, in effect, you can discover a lot about what is and not recorded since 1492. Through no achievement we can call our own, we have evolved on the only blue planet in the known universe. Humankind needs now to realize that we live on the planet that we did not create, cannot control, and must not destroy. Mapping our place on this finite planet matters, now perhaps more than ever before, because we now know that there is no planet B. We only have one Earth. We only get one chance. That's why the World Cup Prize was presented to the Beinecke Library for imagining and representing the other on a small blue planet. Charts, books, maps, and prints. Imagining and representing the other on a small planet. How should we read a book? What can it tell us? Clearly, we need to develop a critical understanding of our most treasured artifact, the book. We could teach each other a course on how to read the book. You could see the description. It would be something like this. This course teaches how to judge a book by its cover and its pages and prints and maps and other elements of its design. Steps towards a forensic archaeology of this early Renaissance technology. Thanks to you all, and to all a good night.